Is this on? Can you hear me? Oh, good, you can. Or at least I can hear me. So welcome to the CCE Public Square. Today's topic is rights versus Roe. Before we do get started, I want to acknowledge the Cub and the incredible audio-visual team who do everything, troubleshoot, and make this event possible. It's live streamed right now into YouTube. I don't know if everyone can see this line with the gaffer's tape. Amazing work by Mitch. But we really do thank everyone involved with the Cub for making this possible. My name's Dave. I'm the Student Engagement Coordinator at the Center for Civic Engagement, and we put on these public square discussions as a way to have some discussions about events that you find topical and interesting that relate to the civic life of your community. So just a bit of housekeeping. If anyone wants to have their hours tracked for participating in this event today, you can do so. Just make sure you get a selfie during our Q&A, and you attach that to your impact that you submit via GivePulse. If anyone is not registered or has any questions, come see me after, or stop by the Center for Civic Engagement in either L45 or L48 just down the hall here. We're happy to have you downstairs in the Cub so you know where we are and are closer to coming to see us. Okay, so we have a topic today that's rights after Roe versus Wade, and I wasn't terribly thrilled with the title, which I think I came up with. I wanted to do dealing with Dobbs, but I didn't know if anyone would know what Dobbs was. But rights language is kind of too masculinist, I think, and frames the issue in a way that prioritizes the legal aspects of what are happening and sort of centers a legalistic masculinist perspective, which I'm not crazy about, but at least we kind of know what we're talking about. So we won't belabor the title too much. But I want to put us all on the same page so that we have a shared understanding of the fundamentals of what the Dobbs decision did, the recent Dobbs versus Jackson. The first thing that it did is that it holds that the Constitution doesn't confer a right to abortion. The Constitution doesn't let people have a right to abortion. The second thing that it does is it overrules one fairly recent, one not so recent court case that did say that there was a constitutionally protected right to abortion. The first is Roe versus Wade, that's almost 50 years old now, and the second was Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And the third thing that the Dobbs decision does is it returns the authority to regulate abortion to the people and their elected representatives. So we'll talk about what that means in 1 minute. But before we do, I wanted to go over just a few. This is, if anyone's going to law school, you might not want to have this be the basis of your law school thesis or whatever you do, but this is a very superficial overview of general legal standards of review. So anytime the government, state or federal government, passes a law, it needs to comply with the Constitution. The judicial branch has the ability to determine what laws do comply with the Constitution. Depending on what the content of the law is, there are three standards that courts apply to figuring out if laws do in fact meet constitutional muster. The first is strict scrutiny. I said that about 15 times this morning, and I think that's the first time I got it right. The second is intermediate scrutiny, and the third is just rational basis. So in the first of these, if a law needs to meet a strict scrutiny standard, the government, the entity that passed the law, has the burden of showing that it is constitutional, that the law is. And the actions that the government takes need to be narrowly to that law. Under intermediate scrutiny, the government still bears the burden of showing that a law is constitutional, but their interest has to only be important and their actions substantially related. Well, in the rational basis scrutiny, the government doesn't bear the burden of showing that a law is constitutional at all. The petitioner does. The person challenging the law has to show that the law isn't constitutional, and the government's actions only need to be substantially related to the law itself. So very few challenges are successful when the standard of scrutiny is a rational basis. The government can kind of do whatever it wants, almost. Lawrence versus Texas, those of you legal scholars out there, that's a counterexample, but not one we'll talk about too much today. So what does that mean for abortion? Over the last 50 years, after Roe versus Wade established a constitutional fundamental right to abortion, the standard, and this again is a simplification, was strict scrutiny. In order to pass a law that restricted abortion, the courts would look at it from a very strict standpoint. In Casey in 1992, that was changed. The fundamental right was qualified somewhat, and the burden was only undue. So laws that were passed couldn't present an undue burden to people seeking abortions. As long as they passed that bar, then the law could be valid. Well, Dobbs flipped that on its head. Now petitioners are going to have to bear the burden of showing that laws are unconstitutional on a rational basis. And thought about talking more about this, but I don't know that I will. Some rational basis tests regarding some laws have more teeth in them than others. So that may happen with Dobbs and other laws created in its wake. So this is a map right here. This is a map of the United States. Because now, after the Dobbs decision, there is neither a federal ban on abortions that Lindsey Graham has considered, he's talked about trying to pass. There is not a federal protection for abortion, and there's no constitutional amendment one way or the other. In the absence of those, the states get to decide what they want to do. And this is what states have chosen to do. Oh, good, this works. So, ooh, this mouse is very sensitive. If we look at this map right here, you can see the key. The sort of blue-green color, these are states that have expanded access to abortion. Maybe I'll click that so you can see where they are. Where we are on the West Coast, a couple Midwestern states and some Northeastern states have actually expanded access. There are more protections and more access to abortion than before the Dobbs decision. These are the states in yellow that have placed some protections on abortion since Dobbs. These states, very few, have not protected abortion in any way since the decision. These states are hostile, so a few southern states and a bunch of Midwestern states and a few Western states. And in these states, in red, abortion is now currently illegal. So the South and close to us, Idaho. And one of the Dakotas that's not north. So if we look, I can give you this web address if you wanted to look at these laws. But right here, if we look at Washington, this site right here will tell us the ways in which abortion has been expanded and any restrictions that have been placed on abortion. For Washington State right now, it's just viability. That's the only ban. And there are some TRAP reporting requirements. I don't know if Sarah will talk about TRAP requirements, but those are just targeted laws against abortion providers. How do I get rid of this thing? I should have tested this. And then Washington, you can't see it here, but you're going to have to trust me, I guess, has put a bunch of protections in place for abortion. Well, we're right here on the map, right here somewhere in Whitman County in Pullman, right across the border in Idaho. Idaho, I'm going to have to reset this map. Idaho is one of the states that has made abortion illegal. So they have a trigger ban, a gestational ban. There are laws in place for 6 weeks LMPs. There's Idaho, it's almost impossible to get an abortion. They've had a copycat law mimicking what Texas is doing. So it's super duper hard to get an abortion in Idaho. It's actually, I don't know if I can say this. Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong. Washington State, I don't know if it's easier to get an abortion or harder to get an abortion in Washington, but the state has placed protections on abortion beyond what existed prior to Dobbs. I'm not going to talk about the ease of getting an abortion or not. So with that said, now that we're all on the same page, I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished group of panelists that we're very excited for. I will just start from my right to left, your left to right, and introduce them. Amy Mazur. I didn't actually how you pronounce your last name. Is that right? Amy Mazur. She's the Johnson Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Washington State University and Associate Researcher at LIEPP, Sciences Po Paris. I'm always afraid of saying French words since they don't pronounce half their letters, and I don't know which ones. But her research interests focus on comparative feminist policy issues with particular emphasis on France. Her most recent books include Gender Equality and Policy Implementation in the Corporate World, Making Democracy Work in Business, edited with Isabel Angeli, from Oxford University Press this year. And she wrote the Oxford University Press Handbook of French Politics, edited with Robert Elgie and Emiliano Grossman. That came out in 2020. She's also been co-convening the Gender Equality Policy and Practice Network since 2013 with Isabel Angeli, and lead editor of French Politics since 2019. Most recently, she's working on the Institutional Mechanisms for Gender Equality project. Seriously? I mean, how cool is that? With the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the Organization of Security and Cooperation of Europe, which I also almost put on my resume, but then I realized that would be a complete lie, so I didn't do it. Next we have, would you prefer that I introduce you and then you talk, or should I introduce you all at once? Maybe we'll just introduce everyone at once. Okay. So next we have Joel Schwarzkopf. He's the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Health and Wellbeing at Washington State University at Pullman. His responsibilities include for Cougar Health Services and University Recreation. He holds a Master's of Business Administration from Colorado State University. My apologies on the game last weekend. And a Master of Physician Assistant Studies from the University of Nebraska. He completed his Bachelor of Science in Emergency Medical Services at Creighton, and he's a Fellow of the American College of Healthcare Executives and serves as Treasurer of the American College Health Association. He loves working with students, is happy that you're all here, and he's passionate about improving health equity and access to services for our Cougs. Next, we have Sarah Dixit, who is the daughter of Indian immigrants. She was born and raised in Southern California before moving to Spokane, Washington for college in 2014, where she studied sociology at Whitworth University. As a student, she formed a campus chapter for Generation Action, a reproductive rights club run by students for students, and she quickly caught the bug for organizing. After graduating in 2018, she began to work at Planned Parenthood of Greater Washington and North Idaho as their community organizer. She's since become their public affairs manager. Alongside her work at Planned Parenthood, Sarah is connected with the larger progressive movement in the Northwest as she works with APIC Spokane, an advocacy organization for the Asian and Asian American community in solidarity with other communities of color. As a young person, Sarah believes that folks of all ages can participate in movement work and that there is profound power in intergenerational and cross-identity solidarity. And finally, we have Sean Kreppen. He is the Executive Director of Campus Ministry for St. Thomas More Catholic Student Center at WSU. Sean has master's degrees in Philosophical Studies for Missionary Discipleship and Theological Studies from St. Vincent de Paul Seminary. Originally from Atlanta, Sean served as a full-time missionary for more than 4 years, first in Atlanta, Georgia, and then in Haiti, working in youth ministry. Before coming to St. Thomas More at WSU, Sean served in Greensboro, North Carolina, and was trained in clinical pastoral education as a hospital chaplain at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. So to start our panel discussion, we'll first hear from Amy about this topic and how it connects with her work and research interests.
Well, thank you so much, David, and the Center for Civic Engagement for inviting me to be a part of this very important discussion and also to be a part of such a wonderful lineup of panelists. Also, I want to thank everyone for coming. I know everyone has super busy schedules, so it's really awesome to see the turnout, and I'm trying to see if anyone has been in any of my classes, but I don't. Does anyone? No? Okay.
Next semester.
Yeah. I teach 201, Poli-Sci 201 methods, and I teach 102 comparative politics, and I'm teaching both of them next semester. So you can come have fun with me if you want. So when David contacted me, it was a result of my piece of an interview that I did with WSU Today about my research, and what I said was that if you take a comparative approach to abortion, looking at the United States, we have a we have the most conflictual context for abortion, and it's over politicized, and that it's important to find common ground. compared to other countries in particular. So what I going to share with you in my time is jumping off from this idea of common ground, but also from the work on my on comparative gender equality policy. And I ultimately hope I can give everyone some food for thought for how to constructively move forward on a variety of levels and not be so panicked. First thing, what is our common ground is we can agree we want to live in a democracy. And in the Constitution, it assures the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, religious freedom, but the separation of church and state. And as David said, not the right to abortion. Never been in the Constitution, never will be. However, abortion rights are in many constitutions in countries. It's not an unusual thing because in our country, we're just really over the top about abortion, basically. So what does this mean? This means that in some of the most stringent laws that are now allowed to be on the books, particularly these trigger laws, but particularly the laws that were originally put on the books in the states to actually to strike down Roe v. Wade, because the way the Supreme Court works is you have to have a law that's being appealed. And so many of these really quite shockingly stringent and anti-constitutional laws were put on the books to try to strike down Roe v. Wade. It was a strategy over a long period of time by the pro-life movement over the years. But what this means is that when you have a law on the books that's based on this notion that life begins at conception, that is not based on science, it's based on a religious belief. So these laws are anti-constitutional in the sense of we do not have a separation, we have a constitutional separation of church and state. And this is I'd like to hear the panelists what they think, also what you think. This is going to be a new terrain for battle over these laws because they are anti-constitutional with regards to separation of church and state, but of course religious tolerance is the norm. Second, we can agree that abortion is not something people want. It is not the desired choice in family planning. Most Americans are against abortion. They don't like it, but they're for women's rights to choose. And so in this country, a comparative problem that we have is we have terrible policies on contraception. And I'm sure you're going to talk more about that. And instead of focusing on abortion, we need to focus on contraception, because then we wouldn't need to have abortion. And we have a terrible policy on contraception in most countries. In most countries, you can get, in Western democracies, you can get contraception on demand and for free. So that's something else to think about. And the other thing is we actually have we have some of the highest rates of abortion in the world. We are 14th in the entire world. You can look it up. It's on WHO. You can look up the link. We can send it out. But we have our rate is 20%, almost 21%, and we are 14th behind Russia, Vietnam, Kazakhstan, Estonia, Belarus, Romania, Ukraine, Latvia, Cuba, Seychelles, and Bulgaria. We are the first Western country with such a high rate of abortion. So again, food for thought. Third, a few additional comparative observations. We're the only Western democratic country, and most of the 192 countries of the world, that does not have a law legalizing abortion. It has passed through the Supreme Court. So the very fact that Roe v. Wade was the law of the land was dysfunctional. It was made by a less than democratic institution because the two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, were too wimpy to make laws on it. And so that led the ground to this giant battle over Roe v. Wade. And to this day, when we're all freaking out about Roe v. Wade turning over, whereas in my view, comparatively, it's not a bad thing. In fact, it's going to make political parties make laws. So I think we need to remember that. And then also, Roe v. Wade was not in step with American perspectives. It was very lenient. You can talk about what Roe v. Wade in terms of the period, I think it's third trimester, you could have the abortion. I believe it's third. Is that correct? Oh, you're not sure? Okay. I believe, and it's one of the most liberal abortion laws in any Western country. With no conscientious objector. Usually laws have conscientious objector stipulations where if you don't want to perform abortion, you don't have to. So Roe v. Wade was just out of control on a variety of levels, but it left the democratic process in the hands of the judges, and we know that's not great, especially with this current Supreme Court. So it's not necessarily bad it's overturned. Ne panique pas, ne panique pas. We're leaving it to the democratic process, which you talked about. Arkansas, the referendum in Arkansas illustrates that really Americans don't want these extremely stringent, they don't want a ban on abortion. It's very clear. They don't want Christian religious doctrine being put into law that life begins at conception. Americans don't want that. And so what we're going to see is the midterms. The midterms are coming up. So what's happening at the midterms? We've got all of the House. We have a third of the Senate. We have 36 governors out of 50 states. We have 56 upper houses in the state legislatures being up for election and 92 lower houses. Democracy, right? So already with Arkansas, we see where the wind might be blowing. But we also see normally midterm elections, usually the non-incumbent party always wins. That is the party that what the president is not the president's party always wins because that's how democracy works. You have alternation, right? Back and forth. Well, already we're seeing the Republicans are not going to get the bump that they would normally get. Already the public opinion polls are showing that. And basically, I think the moderate American voter is going to punish the Republican Party. We already saw Mitch McConnell's the first time we've ever seen a congressional bill on abortion was to apply this very stringent abortion law. That's going to hurt the Republican Party. And already we see 69% of all new registered voters are women. Because in particular, as you might imagine, women really don't want to have Republican parties in office because it seems like that's all the Republican Party wants to do. Finally, we did see that great map. Thank you for giving us that map. But I would say in a third of the states where there are these very stringent doctrinal-based laws, they are being challenged on a variety of levels. Planned Parenthood is involved with it. ACLU is involved with it. Actually, I live in Idaho, by the way, but that Idaho law is actually being, there's a process being initiated by the Department of Justice for violating basic laws. So just because there's a law and there was a Republican majority that passed it, doesn't mean it's going to affect your rights. And in fact, this is a part of the democratic process. This is the country we live in. I'm very proud of our democratic process, but I am hoping that Roe v. Wade actually is opening the door to stopping this back and ping pong game that's being controlled not by political parties, but by interest groups that aren't even elected. They're not even elected, the pro-life lobby, the pro-choice lobby. We need to put it back in the hands of you. So to conclude, I urge you to vote, 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 vote. Get everyone to vote, vote. Because more people vote, that favors the Democratic Party. Fewer people vote, that favors the Republican Party, regardless of gerrymandering. Of course, you're in a state where it's not so crucial. And I also just would say that don't despair. This is a good thing. We're seeing the democratic process in action. We have wonderful groups that are protecting your rights and helping women in need. And we have people, many, many different organizations that are illustrating and expressing their shock when, a 11-year-old girl was prevented from having an abortion. We don't live in a country like that. That's Russia. We do not live in a country like that. So I'm very excited to be on this panel, and I look forward to the continuing dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mazur. Now we will hear from Sarah Dixit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. Apologies for being a little bit late. I had to drive in from Spokane, and there's some construction that I did not expect. So for my role at Planned Parenthood, I'm the public affairs manager. So I do policy and advocacy work, but also some sex ed, some communications, the classic nonprofit thing where you do a lot of different things. And so I think, so for some of the stuff I think I wanted to talk about today, I think the biggest thing is that a lot of us expected the Roe decision to get overturned just because of what we've seen over the past 50 years, right? This issue has been politicized. It has been blown out of proportion in terms of people's emotional attachment to overturning this constitutional, or this right. And so it was one of those things where when the leak happened in May, everyone freaked out. And then when it was confirmed in June, everyone freaked out again, including myself and my team. Like, we all were super devastated. Because even though you expect something to happen, it doesn't remove that blow when it actually does. So, and another point is that what we've seen with abortion bans and what we've seen with Roe already is that the people who are impacted first and foremost are communities of color, folks with lower income, folks who live in rural communities. And those are the people that are getting hit the hardest with all these abortion bans, right? And these are not the people who are making the laws. And so when we are looking to different states and what they're doing, it's a multifaceted issue, right? This issue of abortion is intersectional, and we can't just remove it and silo it into just being a repro rights issue. So that's why when it comes to fighting back, it requires everyone, regardless of your background, and maybe even the niche that you are focusing on in your major, that you are speaking out about it so that people know that folks are angry regardless of the career they're going into, right? This impacts a lot of different people. And not just women, right? So I know it's often that we talk about this as a women's right, but knowing that folks who are non-binary, people who are trans, this impacts a lot of different communities. And so we want to make sure that we are also expanding that to make sure we're not making anyone feel like they're not included in this fight either. So for our affiliate, so Planned Parenthood is a affiliate structure similar to the ACLU and other large organizations. So we have a national office, which is based on the East Coast in DC and New York, but then we have 49 affiliates. So they're all hyper-local, like mini Planned Parenthood. So for us in Greater Washington and North Idaho, we are representative of everything east of the Cascades and North Idaho. But we see a lot of different patients, not just in those regions. We have people coming from Montana. When the decision came out on June 24th, we got patients calling from Utah because they got the call that their appointments had been canceled. Now we're seeing patients call in from Florida, Texas. After SB 8, we definitely got a lot of Texas calls. So this impacts a lot of different people, regardless of maybe what that map says, that, oh, these states are fine, these states are not so much fine. It impacts everybody, because what happens when all these people are reproductive age looking to the states that are blue, or at least have it protected in some way, is that it's going to increase the amount of patients each clinic is then seeing, which causes later wait times for people who live in Washington or California or Oregon. So it has this ripple effect that I think some people aren't necessarily realizing, right? We can feel safe in states like this, but knowing that it is just as much our duty to fight for our neighbors in Idaho as much as it is to fight for people here, because we're all connected, right? Idaho's 10 minutes away, right? So to have such scarily different laws just that far apart is wild, right? So wanting to make sure that it isn't something that's like, oh, well, at least we're okay here, because we want to make sure that we are considering our neighbor as well. And I think the other thing I'll say is that people have been getting abortions forever, and they will continue to do so. Banning abortion isn't going to stop that, right? So making sure that when we're talking about people seeking care, other solutions like contraception or sex ed, things like that, that is great to put our attention in that, but also knowing that people needing access to abortion is 100% valid no matter what their story is. And so that is why we are here. This is why I am here. Like was mentioned earlier in my bio, yeah. I got in this work because of the 2016 election, but my work began way before that. Just being a woman of color, being in an immigrant household, being in a household where talking about sex, talking about anything like this was super taboo. So I didn't get that education, right, growing up. So now knowing all the different things that can happen just based on people's circumstances, that complicates the situation so much more. And I think a lot of people will place people into these boxes of being like, well, you had all this power and privilege, like you don't need access to this thing. But knowing that regardless of people's backgrounds, regardless of where they're coming from, they deserve this access 100%. And I am open to any questions that people have about us or our organization or anything that we're doing.
Thanks, and we will get time for Q&A at the end. I was excited to hear from Amy, Common Ground, and from Sarah, our need to help our neighbor, and that may be a topic that comes up with our next panelist, Sean Creppen.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here like all the rest of us, especially since in the transition of coming to WSU this year, that was one of the most prominent thoughts in my mind since the decision. Like in the 37-hour drive up here, I was like, what am I going to say to a college student when they ask about abortion and pro-life and pro-choice issues? And as previously mentioned, I think I also can relate to some kind of understanding because I also was not born in the United States, and I actually still come from a country where abortion and homosexuality is within our Constitution and is classed as illegal. Also, you have to stand at the national anthem when from where the country that I was born in, or else you also get thrown in jail. So just interesting things about myself. Also, I realized that to take that advance of where's the common ground, what I'm really most excited about in terms of being here is, for me, the common ground is that I believe all of us represent advocacy. We are all advocates. You either are for or you either are against, but you're an advocate for a young woman just by your presence, by being here. And so supporting the right to make that decision to whether it be to vote, to heaven, or for anyone with a Christian or Catholic background to use Christian anthropology, to have an informed conscience when you make a decision in terms of your voting, makes you an advocate. So I applaud all of us for being here today to perform that advocacy and to help grow in that. The approach I kind of want to step into is just basically to kind of reply to some of the things that was mentioned, as well as to kind of give a broad spectrum of where does not only the Catholic Church stand, but from a Christian perspective, what does all of this mean? And so we kind of went through in the PowerPoint already the distinctions between Roe and Dobbs and Casey, which I don't have to touch on again. But particularly, I want to kind of pinpoint a few things, which is one is that within the ruling, or when the ruling was overturned, the previous rulings in Roe and Casey stressed on two particular points that saw that it should be enshrined in the law, that it should be a constitutional right. And those two things were, one, a right to privacy, and then eventually, and I think in the Casey process, it was what we call the due process stipulation. So that had to do with the trimesters and 3 weeks, 3 months in between there, what happens before, after, and these type of things. From a Christian anthropological perspective, we have people of a Christian background, people of a Catholic faith have a particular answer to those questions. Also in the decision by Dobbs, Justice Alito in his syllabus quoted the fact of something that I like to talk about, which is philosophy, because it also enters into the potentiality of life. Like, we believe that life begins from conception. It's not the naturally held, or it's not the normally held view of every person on the planet, but people of a Christian faith and Christian background and Catholics believe that. And they were trying to figure out within the law whether it makes sense to say that someone is potentially alive at one moment and not potentially alive at the next. And they didn't go that route because you would enter into the philosophy of potentiality, of trying to figure out when does life begin and actually occur. And so instead, the law just focused on the right to privacy and the due process. From the church's perspective, I need to kind of start by saying within those two things, if you come from a Christian or a Catholic background, and if you live into Christian spirituality and Christian anthropology, we consider ourselves to be a people of in the world, but not of the world. And so primarily, when we hear the words right to privacy from the Fourth and onward amendments, when it comes to the human person and the potentiality of life, we don't put that right to privacy at the forefront in the same way everyone would. And what do I mean by that? Because from a scriptural understanding and the basis of our faith, we are taught that our bodies, male or female, our bodies are the temples. We are holders, we are indwellers of our Creator. And so my body, in fact, is, if I am a temple in that regard, is not my own. I am the carer of it. It was gifted to me by my Creator. And so, and there are also things that, I will go into towards the end in terms of the Christian anthropology and the understanding of life and the trauma that people who have had an abortion or choose to have an abortion experience, in terms of there are spiritual aspects that words we throw around like surrender and acceptance and these type of things that people think are, oh, well, that's just the church's view, being too archaic, too old. You're asking me to live into something that's really hard. But those words and those meanings actually have a particular basis. From the Christian perspective, or from the Catholic perspective particularly, in our guide to the faith for the Catholic Church, which is the Catechism, it is quoted as saying, direct abortion, that is to say, an abortion that is either willed as a means, as an end, or as a means, is gravely contrary to our moral law in terms of what we believe as Catholics. And the majority of Christian denominations also hold that. Also, from the Catholic point of view, and this touches on something that also one of the presenters also mentioned before, in terms of our history as a faith-based group, as a faith, as a people, from our earliest writings, it was mentioned that this was a moral evil or a moral wrong. So in terms of the teachings of the apostles and those that follow the way from the earliest church moment, it was noted that this was something that we should not do. With that, if you move throughout history, the same way like Roe v. Wade has a history for the last 50 years, if you move throughout the history of the church as a faith-based organization, there have been those discussions about potentiality and actuality of life. There have been those discussions about advancement in science. And actually for us, it was even pointed out in the Catechism also that towards the early 19th century was when we relied on the science, the development of science, to actually inform our conscience into really realizing why we made these decisions. So from the American Medical Association report that was published in the late 1800s, we have a basis that since no other doctrine appears to be a consonant or reason or physiology, but that which admits that an embryo to possess vitality from that very moment of conception, that's why we found that we support the right to life. So we actually kind of use the science as a stepping stone to say, well, yes, we recognize over time, over the church's history, that we've changed, science has advanced, but we still hold that the embryo is a life from the moment of its conception. And then, of course, that goes into the direct contradiction of what medical ethics puts forward versus moral law puts forward in terms of the belief system. And I think the thing that I want to touch on now, as I'm kind of closing my section of it, is that understanding that, well, there is science that suggests or whether this, or the argument that this is a Christian law, I don't think that it's helpful to look at it in terms of a commonality instead of a difference, because when you think about the rare fact that in the previous decisions in Roe and Casey, they use the word potentiality of life, gives life credence. If it said, if the wording in the decisions weren't clear, but in saying that it is a potential life, you're saying it has the potentiality of life. So from that philosophical perspective, it actually was something that, or is something that says, well, this is not something that we just believe that all Christians should believe, and anyone who isn't a Christian shouldn't. The second thing with that is, ironically, throughout the life of this issue in the United States, abortion was not always, and I don't know how many people know this, abortion was not always the Republican ticket. It actually started with the Democrats. And I can't remember if I think it was Ford. But in the late 70s, it was when the particular presidential candidate did not want to enter into that debate. And so they switched sides and moved to the Republican political stance, now supporting the right to not have an abortion, or the right to life. And then you have these words being thrown around in terms of I am pro-life and I am pro-choice. The last thing I would like to touch on from the perspective of advocacy and has to do with the effects of abortion and the trauma. As one of the presenters already said, it's not something we want. It's not something we look forward to. But any kind of physical procedure has an experience on our bodies. If I break my arm, it takes time to heal, right? If you go through any kind of physical procedure, that there is a psychosocial process that you go through afterwards from that. And particularly in regards to abortion, the thing that I wanted to focus on the most was the fact of, and this is again why I say I'm so happy that you all are here, is because the most important thing I realized coming out of this issue and this debate is that there really has been a culture of silence about it. I mean, you hear it in politics for the last decade. It comes up every election season. But there's a silence when it comes to the trauma. There is research that shows that most women that had undergone an abortion wish that they received psychological counseling and advice before actually going through it. That they said they wish they would have spoken to a counselor or spoken to someone that laid out not only the science and the facts, but also laid out what the effects of what might happen to them. But really what has happened instead is that there's just been a culture of silence because this has been provided for us. We want to protect our rights. We have a right to privacy. So let's open this door, but not provide an informed conscience to enable people, families, husbands, wives, women, men, to make those decisions as to whether they should or should not. So the culture of silence is something where I'm particularly big on it being more open and more expanded in terms of the discussion. And of course, when you actually delve into that culture of silence, when you actually speak to someone about it, you hear a huge psychological turmoil that people have experienced in terms of their distress, anger, and resentment towards family members, towards spouses, towards people who caused this to them, that no healing has taken place because no one talked about it. I couldn't talk about it with my family or my friends or my parents. As well as you hear words like sadness and regret from people that have experienced it. They regret that they made the decision. They're sad after the fact. There's a guilt and shame complex that comes into it that seriously psychologically affects us as human beings, because we are people that are communal by nature, and so our emotions affect us. And so I want everyone to be aware that as an organization, the Catholic Church, but not more than as an organization, but anyone within a Christian background or a faith-based background, that we don't just support and say, yay, that abortion is now no longer there's no constitutional basis. It goes back to the states. But like everyone else, we do provide the resources. We do provide resources to help people break that culture of silence. The Palouse Care Center was recently blessed and dedicated by our chaplain, Father Paul, this past weekend. And they actually are going to be receiving a psychologist on staff next month to help break that culture of silence so that women that come in and want to make that informed decision can actually receive that psychological help before and make an informed decision. That's just one example. So as well as all the panelists said, I'm very free to answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks very much, Sean. And that's actually a nice segue to Joel talking about the provision of services available to people and the way this affects them.
Well, hey, good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Joel. I'm the AVC of Health and Wellbeing here at WSU Pullman. And I'm going to start with a disclaimer. That means I work for you, and not that you don't, but I am fully funded by the student fees that you all pay. And I work in the healthcare space, which is a little bit different. So as opposed to some of the opinions you just heard from the private sector or from the academic side, I'm coming very much from the perspective of a student services provider. And I want to frame myself as being fairly neutral in that regard. This is something that's inherent to healthcare as a profession, and as someone who practiced in both urgent care and emergency room medicine for 16 years. That was something that was very front of mind when reproductive rights issues came into my exam room. As you can imagine, in both ER and urgent care settings, this was a topic that came up pretty frequently for me as a provider. And I always took great care to make sure that my patients didn't know where I stood on an issue. So this will be the ultimate test of that because you're all looking at me and wondering where exactly does Joel stand on this issue. And maybe I'll drop some hints or maybe not. Maybe it'll come out in the Q&A. But I think it's very important as a representative of you all as the university to make sure that every student feels included. And that is the role of Cougar Health and any medical clinic for that matter, that you should not be afraid of judgment or being othered or being felt to feel that you did the wrong thing by seeking healthcare for any reason. So first off, if that ever happens to you while you're in our clinic, I want to know about it. You can write down my name because it's the job of a medical provider to provide you with options. Okay. And so whether you have an unexpected pregnancy, whether you're the survivor of an assault or whether you're intending to get pregnant or whether you just want to come in to talk about reproductive options, a provider's political opinion should not be obvious in that discussion. That said, we practice in a state where we have considerable leeway. And so I kind of want to walk back. What does it feel like right now to be a WSU student in the post-Dobbs environment? As was mentioned, we had a little glimmer of that this might be coming because it was leaked, also probably illegal. And I was like you, shocked when the official opinion came out and shocked not so much that it happened, but that in so many ways agencies were not prepared to respond to that news because we'd been given this heads up, right? Many of you saw the email, or I'm assuming if you're a returning student and not just here in your first year, that came out from the university administration. And what you might not be aware of is that behind the scenes, there was quite a bit of a conversation around that message from the university to students and faculty and staff. And that message varied a little bit depending on the campuses. And I think it's actually a point of pride that WSU Spokane and our health sciences campus came out with a little bit different message, which sort of drove the narrative a little bit. And so behind the scenes, I was working with some of my colleagues across the system and on faculty senate and with students in student government positions to really clarify where Cougar Health stood on this issue. And so if you go to cougarhealth.wsu.edu, which is our homepage, shameless plug. Our position statement is right there up front, and I'm not going to read it to you, but that was pretty carefully crafted in consultation with all of those different parties. And I think it was important in that moment, especially for the students and folks that felt caught off guard by the announcement, just to know that we saw that it was happening and that there was support. And again, in a way that was as unbiased as possible, but with that eye towards inclusion. because with the language that was in the Dobbs decision, there was some very pointed, and I would say threatening almost language to folks with certain marginalized identities about how does this affect me. And regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, I think we should show some sympathy towards our fellow human beings and the distress that that caused folks. And so Cougar Health wanted to be very intentional in recognizing that that was causing a lot of distress. And proactively reach out to some of our student interest groups like the Women's Center and like GSORC to let students know that we were available to start handling those requests. So that's one way that it looked to students as it was evolving. And then you probably saw some secondary messaging that came from Kirk and Elizabeth and maybe from some of your respective advisors or colleges that you study in. And I was pretty happy to see that. And I'm also just happy to see that we're here right now having the dialogue. I think that we've sort of forgotten as the Supreme Court term ended what it felt like there in that last couple of days. This decision came the day after the Title IX update came out and a few days after a pretty landmark decision on the Second Amendment. And I think everybody just kind of breathed a sigh of relief. And just as we kind of do in so many other things, Ukraine, you name it, we sort of forget what it felt like in those initial days. And that causes us to lose the passion. Or the urgency. And I can assure you that when the Supreme Court convenes again, these conversations are going to resume. And I'm glad that all of you mentioned advocacy in one way or another, because that is key to this. So whether it's getting out the vote or volunteering with an organization that you're passionate about, that is the way that you can affect change. And I can't tell you how impactful it is for me when I hear from even an individual student, but let alone a group of students, and how much influence you have when you can come together with a unified voice, with a little bit of organization to put pressure on an issue that's important to you. That is key. And so I've been really energized by seeing students out on the plaza, especially speaking on this issue. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And you can, like I said, go to our website or kind of refer back to the University Marketing and Communication Archives, because I know you all want to do that, to brush up on some of those messages that have come out, because that is your university. That's where your tuition and fees money is going. And you should know what the stance is of your administration and of folks like me who get paid to serve you. It might be better left up to the Q&A period because I did want to talk about what access looks like. One of the frequent questions that we get at Cougar Health Services is, do you perform abortions? And the answer is very plainly no. There's some federal regulations that influence that decision. I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find a single private university in the country that has a student health service that provides abortion just because of those stipulations that are tied to federal funding. We do, however, provide referral for care, which would include to Planned Parenthood or other options that a student might wish to discuss. That would also include adoption and kind of the full spectrum of care there. Okay. Also, abortion services aren't available in Pullman. So while we do have Planned Parenthood here, please correct me if I'm wrong or if it's changed, but at this time it all gets referred to Spokane. So it's funny, I saw a gentleman protesting out front of Planned Parenthood, which is over by Safeway, on a Sunday. So not only were they closed, but they're also a clinic that does not approve. So it was symbolic, and I don't want to disparage somebody doing what I just said you should do, which is go out and be an advocate. But sometimes it helps to be in the right place at the right time. Was I correct in that? I want to make sure that.
No. So the Pullman Clinic does provide medication abortion, so up to 10, 11 weeks. And then if you need a procedural abortion, you can go to the Spokane Clinic.
That is an important point of clarification too, because I think as we have these conversations, we always gravitate towards procedural or surgical abortion, whereas medication abortion is a completely different topic. And not in the state of Washington, exactly, yes.
It's not.
And protected by the federal government as an FDA-regulated medication.
Yep.
Yes.
It is not a-
Yes. So we can get into the finer points of that probably in the Q&A. Hey, I'm the only speaker that I welcomed it. That's okay.
You thought you were gonna-
No, that is why we're here, because that's the value of having a team of experts around you. But yeah, want to make sure we're clear on that. We don't do surgical or procedural abortions at Cougar Health Services. We also offer Plan B, which is emergency contraceptive. That's a brand name. So colloquially, everybody calls it Plan B, but the morning after pill, emergency contraception. And one thing that I think folks here would like to know is that your student government, ASWSU, has been advocating for this for a long time. I shouldn't say a long time, in pre-Dobbs, since last spring. It feels like forever ago. But in early spring, ASWSU passed a resolution calling for an emergency contraceptive vending machine on campus. And we've been working with them since then to get that machine. The Dobbs decision accelerated that. And so your president, Jacob, reported to the Regents last week that it was a couple of weeks away from being turned on. I don't know if that's accurate, but in working with ASWSU, I can tell you that we're pretty close. So right here in the Cub, we will have a vending machine hopefully fairly soon. And not only will it have emergency contraception, but it'll have other reproductive health products and just things like COVID tests, Tylenol, Benadryl, that kind of stuff. And hopefully pretty close to where the food pantry is so that folks aren't just seen going to the Plan B vending machine. If that is an option that you need in between now and then, Planned Parenthood does have a very similar machine right out front of their Pullman clinic, which can be accessed 24 hours a day without going into a building. So I wanted to mention that your student government was advocating for you pretty strongly in that regard. And then one other position statement that I wanted to call attention to, which I was somewhat involved with because I'm on the executive committee of the American College Health Association, but the ACHA put out a statement regarding the Dobbs decision almost as soon as it was published. And I don't expect you all to go to the acha.org website and look for this, but you can if you want to. But there's a paragraph in here which I'll read to you, and I'll kind of close on this, which is that college health professionals include clinicians and mental health providers who have licensure and certification obligations and codes of ethics to which they must adhere. They're obligated to follow standards of care and are dedicated to providing the best health care to their campus communities. That is part of our commitment to you, which is that we're going to do it right. We're going to do it in compliance with the law, and we're going to do it with putting you as the student first every time. So go out there, look at the things that I referenced and mentioned, and I think at this point we'll turn it over to Q&A so you can really start grilling us.
Okay, thank you very much. I do want to respect everyone's time, including the panelists. We've got about 1 minute for Q&A, so if everyone can remember to take their selfies when they submit their impact, that will be awesome. If you would like to stick around and the panel can stay for 5 or 10 more minutes, we'll continue to go ahead and take questions. Anyone who submits a selfie that they take right now will go ahead and get their hours tracked in our system. I love the system. So,
I do too. I think it's so cool.
what? Yeah, that's how we do it. It's the easiest way to keep track. So with that said, as we're selfieing, does anyone have any questions for the panel? Yeah. If you wouldn't mind. Yes, you're all right with you?
Hello. Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. This is more of a question for, what was your name again? Sorry. You. Joel. Sorry. But you said you work for WSU and everything. And as a student, when those people come here to protest pro-abort, not pro-choice, why can they do that? Why can't they just pull up to campus and aggravate people kind of? Because the things they say, you don't have to agree, you don't have to be pro-choice or pro-right or whatever, but don't the people that are there also try to aggravate the people that are protesting with them, I guess. I don't know how to phrase this better, but I guess why do they get to do that? Why do they come here?
That's a fantastic question. And I mean, the short answer would be the First Amendment, right? As a public institution that's a recipient of federal money, we're subject to, I would say, a wider interpretation of how the First Amendment applies in what gets designated a free speech zone on our campus. And I could probably punt this to you to explain it better than I could. But I did see the application that one of the most recent groups submitted, and I can tell you that legally they're airtight before they come on campus to do something like that. They know very much what would constitute hate speech or speech which would be considered inflammatory or inciting a riot, and what lines they can and can't cross. To me, it was also, I think, very encouraging just to see students show up to counter protest because, as I said earlier, I'm a kind of a fan of advocacy, no matter what your perspective is, as long as it's done in a manner of civil discourse, because that's how we solve these problems. And I think you spoke to that pretty eloquently, more than I am right now. But hey, that's your job, right? That's the short version of it. And I'm not a lawyer.
I hopefully next time they come back, they're not like too rude or anything. Cause one of the guys was just like saying the like most misogynistic, like whatever, like you can be here and like talk about what you want, but you also don't get to talk down on like women and other people, which is, I don't know if that's the First Amendment or whatever.
Absolutely. And I've seen some groups on the plaza that come on and they're actually wearing body cams. Like, yeah, they were wearing. And to me, that's just a red flag that don't take the bait. They are there to get you on camera doing something which is going to make you go viral, and you don't want to do that no matter how passionate you feel about an issue, because they've practiced some of those inflammatory talking points that are designed to get a response. So sometimes the best choice is just not to engage.
Great question. We've got another over here. If this doesn't fit you, come see us for another one.
Oh, jeez. Did he throw a mic at her? No.
Been there, yeah.
As a protester, be very mindful. Don't fall for what they're saying. I have a few friends who got misdemeanors for that and stuff like that, so be very careful. That was just my point. I'd go out there, be safe, have fun, whatever. But like,
Yeah, don't break the law.
Don't break the law. Be legal.
I'm from the Portland area, and I went to a lot of like civic protests and stuff like that, and like this is very calm in comparison, but they still will say some very mean things to make you upset and put you out this way. So, protect yourself first and your opinions second.
Any other questions from the group?
Yeah, I just have a question about regarding contraceptives. So as we I think one of you talked about kind of like the ripple effect. And I've overheard from some people that I guess this ban on abortion can affect other arenas in Planned Parenthood, like such as IVF and other forms of, parenthood and things like that. So my question is basically like, how will we see even here or in other states, other areas being affected besides just abortion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can take a first stab at that. So in Justice Thomas's part of the Dobbs decision, he brings up things like same-sex marriage, right to contraception if you're not married, things like that. And while that is the fringe, it is certainly something that is on the table. And when it comes to things like the morning after pill, Plan B, IUDs, things like that, a lot of people, well, not a lot, some folks will describe them as quote unquote abortifacients, which is a fake term, right? That's not what Plan B does. That's not what IUDs do, right? They help folks in terms of not after something has been fertilized, it's everything prior to that. So things like that and misconceptions, that is oftentimes because it's not doctors creating these laws, right? It's politicians. And so that is a big red flag in that Lindsey Graham offered up a 15-week ban. So I think nothing would necessarily surprise me, which is scary.
No, I've overheard like people like saying that little things like, well, not little things like IVF would be affected by like abortion bans, like the funding provided for people that are interested in, that kind of stuff, like infertility and things like that.
Yeah, some folks have talked about IVF being a potential thing for the movement to go after, just because it does create embryos, right? So some people, if they do believe in life starting at conception, so when an egg and a sperm meet, that would then implicate IVF as well.
One more question to that.
Thank you. I just wanted to have a response question. Is your name Sean?
Mm-hmm.
Who's that? So I just wanted to talk about religious freedom and the separation of church and state. And I want to say beforehand, I'm not very good at articulating my words, and I respect everybody's opinions. And so as I try to get my point across, I don't mean to say anything harmful or rude. And so, yeah. So the same right that gives you guys to express like the life begins at conception is the same right that gives me to not believe in that. So like, do you think the new like abortion laws are in compliance with like the separation of church and state and stuff like that? So
That's a good question. And I also feel you because I also need to think at least 10 times before I say something out loud. So the Catholic Church as a whole, as an institution or organization, as a faith-based authority, put out a statement, of course, post the decision, that said it supports and lobbies the ideology that it should be returned to the state's decision. That doesn't mean to say that the church, of course, the church has a stance on abortion. We believe life begins from conception. But in the ability to relegate it back to the state's authority means advocacy, means we expect that, you know, a group of people, a body of people, whether they be in church, whether they be in your home, whether it be in your school, once you can vote, that our lobbying and our support for this decision and this right to life does not mean that I exclude yours. And it's actually a point that I wanted to bring across to the end of my presentation, which was this debate, and this has been said by most faith-based organizations, Catholic and Christian in the South, which is this debate is not concluded as yet. Now it's actually starting. We're breaking the silence. And so in that regard, there's still going to be a March for Life next year, right? And the way that you approach that, as we started the discussion on common ground and commonality, is to hold each other accountable, not in the physical sense of fighting physically or verbally, but to be committed to keep discussing it with each other. And in that regard, while you're right, because the religious freedom flips for me and for you, if you're not Catholic, if you're agnostic or whatever religion you are, doesn't mean that I get it and yours is taken away. It means that right now the church is at the position where we welcome the decision to return it to the states, and we hope that the discussion continues so that one day, unfortunate for us, not I say unfortunately, fortunately for us, one day we hope that the right to life will be respected across the board. But we are not antagonistic towards states like Washington State or other states that are now giving applicable access. We are just continuing the fight and continuing the discussion.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you all for coming.